Good evening, everyone. Okay, I'm reminding myself to turn on my record. I am Reverend Dr. Mitzi Smith, the host of Zoom Dialogues, Womanist Zoom Dialogues, and the J. Davison Phillips Professor of New Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. Welcome to our dialogue today entitled Say Her Name, Preaching and Teaching for Freedom. Insisting upon the inclusion of Black women and girls in discourses around police violence and gender violence sends the powerful message that indeed all Black lives matter. If our collective outrage around cases of police violence and misconduct is meant to serve as a warning to the state that its agents cannot kill without consequence, our silence around the cases of Black women and girls sends the message that certain deaths do not merit repercussions. So we continue to advance a gender-inclusive narrative in the movement of Black lives. In December 2014, the African American Policy Forum and Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies launched the Say Her Name campaign. And it's meant to bring awareness to the often invisible names and stories of Black women and girls who have been victimized by racist police violence, and it provides support and advocacy for their families. We cannot forget. We cannot allow our women and girls to be twice erased. We will not forget Sandra Bland, Rakia Boyd, Kayla Moore, Michelle Cusseau, Pamela Turner, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Charlena Lyles, Tatiana Jefferson, Corinne Gaines, Breonna Taylor, and others killed in their beds, in their living rooms, in their neighborhoods, including those in police custody and the young Black girls knocked out of their chairs and onto floors into schools. We will not forget our sisters, female children and their mothers, sisters and brothers and fathers in our teaching, our preaching, our writing, and or our activism. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. And it will not come until the killing of Black women and girls matters, until all Black lives matter. Too often we only color within the hermeneutical lines already drawn for us by white translators and commentators whose Eurocentric approaches to interpretation treat Black lives and epistemologies, that is, knowledges and wisdom, as inferior, illegitimate, or only marginally significant at best. The same is true of Black and brown women and men and people of color who read scripture with an androcentric lens, unable or unwilling to read against the grain of oppressive ideas and constructions, even of the divine, unwilling or unable to treat the lives and bodies of Black females as unequivocally sacred, unwilling to expose, name, reject ideologies that do not promote freedom. We must learn to read differently if we will preach differently. Religion can indeed be an opiate for the oppressed. Slave masters relied on this. Or it can be a catalyst for justice and freedom. We declare that Goddess Divine reveals herself to Black women and our communities. Goddess Divine still speaks and reveals herself to us. She inspires Black women, and at the top of her agenda is justice and freedom. Our panel of Black female scholars and clergy will present from their unique experiences, expertise, and hopes on the topic Say Her Name, preaching, teaching for freedom, preaching and teaching for freedom. So in the order in which they will speak, our panelists are the Reverend Dr. Genetta Y. Hatcher. She is an itinerant preacher, a pastor by calling, a lecturer, and a training and leadership development professional. She most recently served as a seminary vice president. Dr. Teresa L. Fry Brown is an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the Brandy Professor of Preaching at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta. She's a womanist scholar. She has published 5 books and 40 plus articles on homiletics, particularly focusing on the importance of Black women's transformative voices. Reverend Eva Melton earned her MDiv at Ashland Theological Seminary, and she is the founder and pastor of the Firm Foundation Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The Reverend Dr. Renita Weems, PhD, the first woman to earn her PhD in Old Testament, African-American woman in Old Testament Studies at Princeton University in 1989, is a biblical scholar and author, academic administrator, public intellectual, and ordained elder in the AME Church. Weems is a former associate professor at Vanderbilt Divinity School. She has been a visiting professor at Spelman College and is academic dean at American Baptist College. Reverend Yvette R. Blair is a womanist theologian, an elder in the Methodist Church, and she serves as senior pastor at First CME Church in Dallas, Texas. She is a Doctor of Ministry student at Memphis Theological Seminary, where her work focuses on the intersection of faith, food security, and displacement of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. Reverend Dr. Shively T.J. Smith is the assistant professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology. She completed her PhD in New Testament studies at Emory University. Her first book is called Strangers to Family, Diaspora and First Peter's Invention of God's Household, published by Baylor University Press. Reverend Yolanda Norton is a doctoral candidate in Hebrew Bible at Vanderbilt Divinity School. She is currently the visiting professor of Black theology at the Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas. She is also the assistant professor of Hebrew Bible and the H. Eugene Farlow Professor of Black Church Studies at San Francisco Theological Seminary. I believe it changed its name to Redlands University. She is also the curator and founder of the Beyonce Mass. So our presenters will present for 8 to 10 minutes each, and then we will go into our Q&A and dialogue. Reverend Dr. Hatcher.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. So glad to be here. I appreciate the panel, and I appreciate what we're talking about today, because something for quite some time has been bubbling up in my spirit. Even as I would hear Black Lives Matter, I have some very cute wooden earrings that say Black Lives Matter, but there was something that says there's more to the story. And for me, it was the fact that Black women lives matter.
Mm-hmm.
And now I can say it and I can just put it out there without hesitating, without worrying what other people will say, because it was just something in my soul. And we've often, all of us have heard the often quoted words from Malcolm X, and actually it was something he said in 1962. And he said, the most disrespected person in America is a Black woman. The most unprotected person in America is a Black woman. The most neglected person in America is a Black woman. And I have to tell you, most days as a Black woman, I feel the sting of disrespect. Mm-hmm. I live with my back exposed and unprotected and bear the burden of neglect. This is my personal story, but in many ways, I'm sure both large and small, it is sadly the story of most, if not every Black woman in America, of every woman of color everywhere. Sadly, the outcry for Black women is sometimes simply muted. As you mentioned earlier, those responsible for the creation of Say Her Name movement note that it started because we forget Black women killed by police. This campaign that was created seeks to bring awareness to the often invisible names and stories of Black women and girls who have been victimized by racist police violence. Their names matter. Natasha McKenna, her name matters. Tatiana Jefferson, Michelle Clouseau, Janisha Fonville, Gabriela Navarez, Tanisha Anderson, their names matter and their names should be said. Say their names and hear their stories because their lives matter. We cannot forget them when we call out the name of our brothers, and we love our brothers. This is not exclusion of, this is incorporation of. But sadly, our nation and our world suffers from amnesia when it comes to the lives and stories of Black women. Sexism and patriarchalism and misogyny are words that are synonymous with what it means to be a Black woman in this world. And it's found in the church, corporate America, and the police department. It's not just the corruption in the police department. Black women are especially likely to be victims of intimate partner violence, most often raped. Even as we constitute more than a third of the female homicide victims in the US, we only make up 13% of American women. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia Law School, and she's also the executive director of the African American Policy Forum that started Say Her Name movement, warns that Black women continued exclusion from stories about police brutality, racism, and anti-Black violence contribute to an erroneous notion that Black men are the chief victims of racism and state-sanctioned violence. Say Her Name does not seek to replace Black Lives Matter or dilute its power, but its aim is to simply add perspective and lived experience to the conversation of racist injustice against Black women, against our sisters. Precious Foundrin, in a recent article, noticed that when Black men are killed by the police, it feels as though the world is flipped upside down. People get angry, they organize very quickly, they hit the pavement to protest and march. And all of our timelines are filled with petitions to sign this and sign that. Let's march, we're not gonna take it anymore. But when a Black woman is killed, there may be some petition here or there, maybe a GoFundMe campaign set up, but she questions where's the outrage that gets precincts burned down when a Black woman is killed. Crenshaw adds that during slavery in the US, Black women endured endless labor, sexual assault, and being torn away from their children. However, she supposes that the entire history of slavery and the efforts to challenge it, that the center of all of it focuses not on the Black woman experience necessarily, but on how the Black man experienced slavery. We don't tell the stories about the disrespect that Black women experience. So it comes as no surprise that when the police treat Black women in ways that are continuous with that same kind of invisibility that history has written for us or not written. Last year, I had the, privilege or perhaps even responsibility of facilitating a week-long workshop on R. Kelly. And my task was to talk about how do we stop R. Kelly from coming into our neighborhood, from robbing and destroying the lives of our Black sisters. This was a state Congress, and pastors and leaders from across the state were there. But I began to notice that the numbers were low, and some pastors even told me, you know, some of the pastors, the brothers, said they're not coming because they don't want to see us villainize a Black man. And as I saw the faces and read the stories of those sisters that had been a part of R. Kelly's Pray, I was sick into my stomach at how many people benefited from, ignored, or even overlooked, or were complicit in arranging for these girls, sometimes underage, to meet up with Kelly. I wonder whether Kelly would have been so free to roam if his victims weren't Black girls and women. Mm-hmm. Poet Adrian Monet offers that it's difficult to quantify any brutality against human beings. It's not more difficult when it comes to Black women. It's just easier for us to ignore them, because if we acknowledge them, then we must acknowledge all of the women affected by violence and brutality, not just by police, but by an entire patriarchal racist system. At root is the fact that this country never loved Black people. We have a president that shows us that every day. At root is the fact that this country never loved Black people. And of course, they have no love for Black women. Mm-hmm. Our nation, our world set out to protest the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that we were forced to watch our brother George Floyd die while calling on the name of a woman, his mother, say her name. But we must not forget that a 17-year-old girl named Darnella Frazier was the one who filmed this viral video of George Floyd. Say her name. Mm. One of the saddest commentary in the Bible, in the sacred text, is told of Tamar, King David's daughter. Her story is found in 2 Samuel 13. It is a story of rape and brutality and yet invisibility. I preached once the unauthorized biography of Tamar, that other people were content to write Tamar's story. The saddest part of this commentary, and I would add the saddest part in the sacred text, is 2 Samuel 13:20. And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. After her brother Amnon had raped her, and after everyone had been complicit to it, her life seemed not to matter, because she ended up living desolate in her brother's house. Amnon, Jonadab, Absalom, and even King David remained silent to the brutality that was inflicted upon Tamar. Tamar died that day. Not physically, but her soul died. And there are parts of my soul as a Black woman that have died because of racism, patriarchism in the church, in corporate America. Her death, for all intents and purposes, went unnoticed. Her story serves as a warning to our nation that Black women's lives matter. Say our names, darn it, because we're coming to redeem our time and ensure that our revolution go live. We will not sit idly by anymore and die in desolation. Say what you want, but Hagar, a Black woman, she was the first one that gave the father of the nation, Abraham, his son. Say her name. Adrian Monet, in a poem called Say Her Name, says this as I conclude. She says, I'm not here to say, look at me and how I died. So brutal of death, I deserve a name to fit all the horror in. I'm here to tell you how, if they mentioned me in their protests and their rallies, that they would have to face their role in it too. My beauty too. I've died many times before. The blow to the body I've bled. Many months before the bullet to the flesh, we know the body is not the end. Call it what you will. But for all the handcuffed wrists of us, the shackled ankles of us, the bent over to make room for you, all of us, how dare we speak anything less than I love you? We who love just as loudly in the thunderous rain as when the sun shines golden on our skin and the world kisses us unapologetically. We be so beautiful when we be. How you gonna be free without me? Your freedom tied up with mine's at the nappy edge of my soul. My name is Genetta Y. Hatcher. Say my name, darn it. Say my name. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hatcher. Woo. Thank you for getting us started here. Dr. Teresa Fry-Brown.
Good afternoon, Dr. Smith, and all the sisters on the panel.
Good afternoon.
I approach this topic from the vantage point of a person who's active in the church and teaches preaching. So you'll feel the academy and the church all wound up together, but that's who I am. So I think about this word name that is the essence of your being, and once it's erased, it means you no longer exist. and that you never existed, that you are nothing. And so my initial thoughts are how many times in my 69 years I felt unnamed and invisible and looked past, and my humanity was denied, and how many times I've witnessed Black women apologizing for being Black and woman. That in the life of the church, if we want to preach, then we're trying to take over, we're trying to be men. In the academy, we don't have the acumen to be who we're supposed to be. And search committees say that we shouldn't be in places because we don't know as much as anybody else. And people seek to cancel our humanity and our sacrifice. And we're charged with saving all the baby boys as if they didn't need us to be born in the first place. And people fear that we're too independent if we don't bow down and worship them. That because our genitalia is different, that we have to be less, and forgotten and dehumanized contributions of workers for justice. We may name Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, but what about the other ones whose names we don't know, who also fought and died? I watched people protesting Black Lives Matter, but they didn't know anything about the 3 women, Con Cooler and Garza and Tomei, that even started it. And once they find out, then they try to have other words, but it's already left the barn, right? And this mammification of Black women, that we have to be long-suffering and suckle everybody in the world and put our needs last, and if we don't, we're a traitor to our race, and we're trying to be the backbone, but you sit on your backbone, so I don't want to be anybody's backbone. And so I think about Toni Morrison in The Origin of Others saying, and I quote, "How does one move from a non-racial womb to a womb of racism, to belonging to a specific loved or despised yet race-infected imagination?" So I keep thinking about this say her name that seems to be something that currently started, but I also do some history on the side. But less than a year after Emmett Till, Anjanora Spencer was hung, was lynched in Hyde, North Carolina. She didn't even have a first name, Mrs. Frankie Clay in 1957 was lynched, but did we forget them? Or Eleanor Bumpers in 1984. Who speaks for those women who have been enculturated to be in the background, to be the scenery, to be the fodder for someone else to step forward and for history to raise them up, but not us? When I think about all the calls for mass incarceration, but we forget that right now Black women make up 4.4% of all police-initiated stops. That of the 231,000 women and girls in prison, 29% are Black women. 5% of the people in jail are Black girls. 35% of the girls in juvenile facilities are Black girls. And so when we're talking about save the baby boys, let's try to save the baby girls also. Let's not make excuses or have somebody say, you don't care anything about men, but what about me? Dolores Williams talks about a need to examine our faith. So I teach preaching. So one of the things I do, there's a documentary called 20 Feet from Stardom. It talks about all the women that were background singers that made everybody else look good. That through self-critique and not getting the money and being told they had to look a certain way, that they had to be socialized a certain way, but don't be too gifted. Don't do too much because somebody else is supposed to be up front. This muting and erasing of Black womanhood. And for me, the term Black woman preacher has been a contradiction, but I also know that my very existence means I'm a protest from the start. So I teach preaching. And so I teach womanist preaching. And so when I make a syllabus out, I don't add a Black woman as a last thought. She's interwoven all the way through because that's who's standing in front of them. And so even if someone in the classroom starts the first day of class raising their hand, but are you really the professor? Well, I have the pen right now. And the saying says, as long as the lion has the pen, the hunter doesn't win. So I'm a lion in the classroom, you hear me? And so I talk about contested spaces, that people set up barriers. And I'm always amazed at the number of Black denominations that say they're about freedom, but they are erecting more barriers than anybody else about who can be in certain places, who can preach, who can teach, who can stand in a pulpit, what do you have to wear, how long does your skirt have to be, what color your hair has to be, what jewelry you have to wear. But we're talking about freedom. But the exceptionality is we're supposed to take it and just swallow it and smile. Well, my mother taught me not to smile unless I thought something was really funny. And so I don't do that. And so when I teach, I try to talk to people about how do we raise the consciousness of people about God language and Godness? How do we talk about the value of all individuals as well as the community? How do we use nonviolent homiletical language? So when people say you killed the house, you slayed it, that to me is violent language. So how am I going to talk about freedom and then the follow-up is that you killed something? And using your own voice, coming to your own voice and not trying to speak as if somebody else is speaking at that time. And stop separating walls in the language that we use in our sermons. That it's all right to talk about the named women of the Bible. I'll leave that to the biblical scholars. But what about the women that are in the background? What about the little boy's mama that fixed his lunch? What about those women? And that's most of us. Most of us are not the named women. They're the women that are essential to the story, but don't have anybody name them, or it's better because they didn't write the text that we don't mention them because that might mean they have too much power. What about this sense of Parathea Hall's freedom faith and how we talk about the political aims of our sermons? Are we talking about let's go out and do something for a few, or are we talking about let's do something for everyone? How do we name people in a sermon? What are our descriptors of people? What jokes are made in sermons about certain people? How are we humanizing the entirety of the congregation, not just the people who tithe? How do we celebrate God as a whole unit with not a lot of hype, but hope for everybody? So we're going to talk about justice. We need to talk about the many differences there are in people and stop eliminating boxes for everybody to check off. That I added one. That it's all right to have a flyer up if there's one woman. What's the ratio of expertise? It's like in a seminary where as long as you have one that fills 2 boxes, you don't need to hire anybody else. It doesn't matter how many people have the skills, but we have one, so we're going to trot them out like a dog and pony show. But I'll leave that alone right now. What are the stereotypes of women? I was in a conversation with someone the other week about, can we find a woman who is not either a Jezebel or so holy that nobody touches her? And again, I go to my biblical text sisters right there. And what are we saying about the roles of men and women in our churches? What are the contexts and the balanced language that we use? And how do we have information inside and outside of the text? Where is the moral wisdom? I also talk about, and this becomes very important to me, if we're going to talk about justice, not only in the streets, but justice in the church and justice in the academy, we need to learn to cite Black women. We need to understand that Black women write too. We need to understand that we don't always have to just preach on Mother's Day and Women's Day. We don't always have to use all the women in the text, but the text is for everybody. So I'm not quite sure why we always are kind of trotted out for Women's Day and go back and then you don't come back out again until the next year. And so one of the things that is part of what I do to practice justice in the academy is to make sure that I'm breaking down barriers for the women that come after me, that somebody's able to do something afterwards. And so, yes, I have the bandy chair in preaching at Cantor, but there are other Black women who are also teaching preaching. So when I cite Black women, it's Jennifer Brooks at Garrett, Veronis Miles is at Wesley, Deborah Mumford's at Louisville, Lisa Thompson's at Vanderbilt, Melva Sampson's at Wake Forest, Courtney Buggs at Christian Theological. Donna Allen is an independent scholar, but she's a bad sister, and she's out in California. And Carolyn Knight and Martha Simmons and Valerie Bridgman and Joy Moore, Nichelle Guidry, Dominique Robinson, Chelsea Yarborough, Gina Stewart, Elise Barrymore, Nicole McDonald, Janae Pitts-Murdoch, Moya Harris, Jennifer Carter, and Dominique are all in a PhD program. And so one of the things we have to do, and this comes from Maria Stewart, I quote, "I'm of a strong opinion that the day on which we unite heart and soul and turn our attention to knowledge and improvement, that day the hissing and reproach among the nations of the earth against us will cease. And even those who now point at us with a finger of scorn will aid and befriend," but this is my favorite part. "It is of no use of us to sit with our hands folded, hanging our own heads like bulrushes, lamenting our wretched condition, but let us make a mighty effort and arise. And if no one will promote or respect us, let us promote and respect ourselves." That was 1832, and here we are. And so my idea is, with all due respect to my soror and sister Shirley Chisholm, the way I address justice is I get tired of saying, give me a seat at the table. I'm for tearing down the whole, I'm on Facebook, tearing down the entire table and erecting a new one. My dining room table is round for a reason, and that way we fit and talk to each other, because even at a long table, there's power dynamics. And so for me, if we're going to practice justice, let's tear down what we had and start all over again. That's where I am. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. Yes, make your own table. Make sure it's not like the one you just left either. Right. Thank you so much. Yes. I have to say this one thing. I was just, unfortunately, African-American colleague scholar recently accused me of academic bullying because I insisted she cite other Black women. But anyway, we'll go on from there. Reverend, thank you so much. Reverend Eva Melton.
Hey everybody, I'm happy to be here. I am a pastor, but also a community organizer. And so I hope that my presentation reflects that. So Dr. Fry Brown has already quoted this, but until the lioness tells her side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. I want to talk about what it means and when to understand to disempower the narrator. So this African proverb speaks of the power of the pen, the storyteller, or the narrator, the one given the privilege, or who takes the privilege to narrate a biblical story. They are powerful because they can put words in the mouth of God, choose when women speak or not, gloss over the mistreatment and oppression of women, and introduce and depict women in a way that leads the reader to believe that women are deserving of the violence and the oppression that befalls them at the hands of men or at the hands of God. So our work in preaching for freedom is to look beyond the storyline presented to us and bring our expertise and our experiences to uncover oppressive systems, assumptions, and bias in the scripture, and then use our imaginations to humanize the women in the text by telling her story. So at times, we must take liberty to disempower the narrator in biblical stories and in present day cases of police brutality against Black women. So what does that method look like for me on a week-to-week basis? If we could use Sapphira in Acts chapter 5 as an example, and we read this story through the lens that privileges Sapphira and not the narrator, we find that this woman is only implicated because of her association to her husband. She does not assert any guilt on her own. And in order to paint Sapphira as a villain, the narrator takes liberty of being omniscient and claims that Sapphira has consented to her husband's behavior. So the narrator desires to make the reader see Sapphira as a villain, thereby making her worthy of the lethal violence that she received at the hand of God. Like Breonna Taylor, we only get to hear Sapphira's voice when she is in the line of danger. Sapphira simply answered Peter's question, and then violence fell on her. And Breonna Taylor simply screamed out and wanted to know who was at the door, but violence was already at her doorstep. But the problem with Sapphira didn't start when she stood before Peter. It didn't start when her husband Ananias succumbed to death. It started when a narrator took privilege to make Sapphira a co-conspirator with her husband. And so likewise, when we think about Breonna Taylor, the problem for her didn't start when the officers showed up at her door in plain clothes. It did not start when they chose not to announce themselves and rammed down her door. Or even when a white female judge signed off on 5 no-knock warrants only after 12 minutes of reviewing them. Just like Sapphira, the person who set the stage for the violence unleashed upon Breonna Taylor was the narrator. In this circumstance, I want to talk about who the narrator is. Before a judge signs off on a warrant, a detective draws up an affidavit. And the whole goal of the affidavit is to present a storyline that would lead to the warrant being approved. But this just wasn't any warrant. It was a no-knock warrant, which is inherently violent. And so like a skilled biblical narrator, this white male detective implicated a 26-year-old Black woman by a former relationship to a Black man who had drug charges. He constructed her misidentification in a way that would allow anyone who defines a Black woman by the behaviors of the men in her past or in her present life. We think about this story and investigate this story and look at Breonna in a way that allows us to preach for freedom and change. Nowhere in the affidavit was Breonna documented as transporting drugs or even engaging in behavior as the two men in the affidavit. But yet her name, like Sapphira's, was listed as a co-conspirator. Breonna doesn't get to tell her own story in the same way that Sapphira was not able to. And so we don't get to hear that she's an essential worker in the middle of a pandemic. So on March 3rd, while a detective was crafting and telling her story, she was risking her life working in an emergency room as a technician. And if you read the affidavit, she's only looped into this case because of her ex-boyfriend's suspected drug trafficking activity. By this association to the man in her life, or former life, she is dehumanized and presented as a villain, and thereby presented to a judge as worthy as of the assault on her body. This all-knowing detective placed pictures in the affidavit of what should have been the safest place for a Black woman. Pictures and a description of her home. This violence just didn't happen to Breonna. A whole ecosystem operating on racism and implicit bias against Black women thrust this situation to her doorstep. A whole system that values recovering drugs over the preservation of human life launched bullets in her body. So in the same way we choose to call out bias of women in the scripture in our preaching, we can apply the same tools to unearth bias in present day police brutality cases that involve our Black mothers, our daughters, and our sisters and our aunties. Because for the judges, the police and detectives, and even the media, the affidavit is just as sacred as scripture. We can take the power back from the narrator and humanize both Sapphira and Breonna. Black women are often mislabeled and misidentified by the past and present men in our lives. By our fathers, by our brothers, by our lovers, and even our former lovers, such as Breonna. That angle never honors who we are and the full agency we have as women. And so this is why we must be comfortable with challenging those who attempt to create a narrative about our lives without our own voice, in our sacred text and in systems that impact our lives every day. So until the lioness tells her story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
Thank you so much, Pastor Eva. Yes, we need that. We can't accept everything the narrator says, right? Thank you so much. Wonderful. All right, so Dr. Renita Weems. Dr. Renita Weems.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really want to thank you, Dr. Smith, for inviting me, and I am delighted to be here with colleagues and friends on this very important panel, and on a very important topic. Say her name and calling us to the village, if you will, as the women in the red tent, to talk about injustices that Black women have and violence against Black women that is much older than these last few years. We know that, but certainly has heightened our consciousness in a very important kind of way. And we are thankful to the three sisters who are the founding mothers, if you will, of the Black Lives Matter type name itself as the hashtag, the movement, the creative geniuses. And there's no surprise to any of us on this panel, and probably those who are participants, that it would take Black women to come up with that Black Lives Matter and how important that is. And so I appreciate rather these kinds of panels because they do galvanize us, I hope, and and reawaken for others, and perhaps just teach some others who are some of the participants and listening in on. But as I was kind of forming my own thoughts about what to share and how to share and how I might kind of lend my own kind of perspective, as certainly as a Bible scholar, yes, and certainly as an ordained clergywoman, and yes, and as a writer, yes. As someone who also appreciates history, I wanted to give a little bit of some of my own background and how I come to this topic and how I come to probably seeing this as a bittersweet moment in history, how I see this as the best of times, I think that's Dickens, and the worst of times. In some ways it is, I am encouraged by this moment because I think that there is a kind of awakening for Black women that I have not seen in my 60 plus years. A kind of awakening along trajectory of across demographics, if you will, of Black women, not just among academic Black women, not just among C-suite and high achieving Black women, but I think even the sisters in the street, there seems to be an emerging consciousness about the whole nature of what we might call in the academy patriarchy. Perhaps what might be called in the streets might be understood even if they don't understand the word sexism, but a kind of anti-woman, even if they don't know the word patriarchy, even if they don't necessarily know the word sexism, even if they don't necessarily know the word misogyny or misogynoir, all of our, kind of elite terms and nomenclature that we kind of draw on and say with great ease, or may never have heard the word womanism. But there is a kind of sense that even the regular sister, if you will, and we all are regular sisters, when you strip us down from all the titles, but you know who I'm talking about. Our cousin them and our baby sisters them and our nieces and our own daughters, perhaps. There is a kind of sense that there's something is different about the way in which Black women are treated. Even if they don't have a name for it, there is a kind of a sense. And for someone who's been here also 60 plus years, I find it kind of, I don't want to say refreshing, but I am encouraged that what in the academy we might call sexism and patriarchy, androcentrism, I think Dr. Mitzi, you used earlier, that there's a kind of awakening of that. And I say that to say this, that I think that one of my conversation with younger women, excuse me, I'm always amazed at how they are still shocked by sexism. Just shocked that this happened. We are not shocked by racism, but I think Black women are still shocked by sexism, that somehow or another we thought that the social justice movement, that the civil rights movement, that the Black Power movement, that even the Black Lives movement included us. And we are surprised, we are stunned. I mean, so even as I listening to all of our conversations and as all the ones that I've been reading and hearing, I find that younger women are those of us those who have not been really studying and paying attention to this for a long time are stunned that sexism, anti-womanism is real, and it is a part of our culture, and it is systemic, and it is old as the Bible and before. That we are not just talking about bad behavior. We're not talking about not being kind to women. We're not just talking about not being thoughtful and not remembering the sisters and not calling the sisters names because they're just bad guys. But we're talking about systemic sexism. We're talking about the nature of a culture, the nature of our society, the nature of the systems in which we live that renders women, but Black women especially, invisible, inferior and nameless. So this is not just happenstance. That is what I'm asking us to kind of, asking those of us who are thinking about this to think about that in all of our diatribes about the isness of the situation. Part of that isness is that we are talking about, we live in cultures that are millennial in age, where women have, from those of us who are Bible scholars, and the world existed before the Bible. And let me just make that very clear. So even as we call out the Bible, we're not talking about this is the beginning of time. This is just a little text that came up, millennial after the world really started. But let's just say this whole, from its inception, if you will, it's certainly the inception of systems and organizing the world, and there are a lot of people who have written about that we're talking about an anti-woman. We're talking about sexism. We see it throughout the Bible, despite the exceptional women. And I have made a living looking at the exceptional women by all means. But in spite of there are always, we who are on this panel are exceptional women. We are exceptional, but we are not. But we know that there's a whole nother group of sisters out here who do not enjoy certain even some of the privileges that we enjoy, if you will. But at the same time, we each have a story that we share with these other sisters. So I'm saying all of that to say that my own journey to becoming a Bible scholar, I want to go somewhere there in the 80s, if you will. And there was a lot of, life did not start in the 80s, but I'm just talking about my own journey too, because I'm thinking about what it meant for me in 1987 and in the 80s to write a book like Just a Sister Away, if you will. Mm-hmm. What it meant back then to want to look at biblical stories and raise questions about the women in the Bible, and that was different. That was and make those Bible stories accessible to regular women, and the kind of pushback and the kind of resistance and the kind of shock that has always been met. I mean, all of us on this panel can have stories that we can tell about not only the resistance from men, but we're talking about the resistance also from women around trying to raise consciousness. And I'm trying to talk about raising consciousness about the oppression of women, that we have not known how to talk about that. That's what I'm trying to say as we talk. And I think that this moment, when I say it's the best of times and the worst of times, the best part of this time calling #SayHerName is that perhaps we have found a way to talk about the oppression of women, perhaps something about this era that has made us step back and say, maybe something really is going on here that is larger than what we have suspected. And as I say a lot to audiences, sexism is not just, we have known how to talk about racism. We have not known how to talk about sexism. We have trusted the brothers that they would lift as they are lifting, that they would lift us as they climb. And we have discovered that ain't necessarily so. And that if we do not write our own narratives, we would not be the best of the brothers, the best of the men. If we don't write our own stories, if we don't call these sisters names. And so that when the men do not include us, first I would like to suggest we stop being shocked, stop being hurt, stop crying, stop wasting the 2 weeks that you're gonna waste being, I just can't believe they did this to us. Can you believe they did this? How could he have done this? If you would just get up off the floor and just stop with all of that, we could make a little dent in the movement if we could just stop wasting all that time of grieving. Let's stop grieving over sexism. It is real. It's in the water. It's intrinsic. And so therefore, if you take that, it's like most of us who have worked in predominantly white institutions. we're supposedly like women like certainly Teresa and I, Dr. Teresa Fry Brown and I, you go in there expecting racism. You're not going in there shocked by it. Now it comes in different forms and it throws you off, but you're like, you just taste the atmosphere, like, yeah, right, yeah, right, yep, I got this, yep, I know what that's going on over here. But and you just you're like, this is the way this is going to be up in here. Mm-hmm. But we find we are shocked by the sexism as Black women. Mm-hmm. And so we are stunned and we just can't believe it. And I would submit that a lot of things that many of us have gone through, we have thought it was racism, but a lot of times, and we cannot parse it. I know I'm Black and female, but if you really are a tinkerer like I am, and a parser and an exegete like I am, you begin to see some of this, man, that wasn't a Black thing here. That was some woman stuff up in here. And I have, if I may use an example, how many times over the years as a Black woman professor have I seen how Black male professors are treated that's different from the way that I have been treated? How many times have I seen students wailing and crying, women students going to the Black male professor who really cares very little about them, and seeking solace and comfort. And I'm the Black woman in the office next, but that's not who they want to talk to. So all I am saying is that, I mean, as I try to close here as well, for those of us who are doing this work, even the activists especially the activists among us, as we look at this historically, take it for granted and assume that the world is anti-Black woman, then you can spend some good creative work and begin to really know that this is not something that we put down. We have to, from when we're talking about Frances Ellen Watkins Hopper, whether we're talking about Anna Julia Cooper, whether we're talking about Mary Church Terrell, whether we're talking, about Nanny Helen Burroughs, whether we're talking about from Ella Baker, whether we're talking about Prathia Hall Wynn, Reverend Dr. Ella Mitchell, we're talking about women who have down through the years have had to keep pushing, to keeping Black women's names at the forefront, whether it was white women's movements, white men's movements, or Black men's movement. It will take Black women, when and where I enter, Black women enter with me. So I will conclude with what has, for me, has been a poem that I have been celebrating quite a bit over the last couple of weeks by Lucille Clifton. And I think that it is an important, as we talk about Breonna Taylor, we talk about Sandra Bland, we talk about Rekia Boyd, we're talking about all of these women and girls, women and Black women and girls. Lucille Clifton says, come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. And I say that to say, yes. And there are, yes, Sandra Bland was killed, but in other ways, she is still living by the fact that we continue to call her name. Yes, Breonna Taylor. Yes, Rekia Boyd. Yes, to all the names. But until the killing of Black women, Black mothers' daughters, is as important as the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons, not only we who believe in freedom, we who are Black women cannot rest. But I love Ella Baker's last verse to this, if I'm the way. She says, I'm a woman with a voice, and I must be heard. And at times I can be quite difficult because I'll bow to no man's word. And she meant even Martin Luther King, because the two of them did not get along, because she thought he was a sexist. She thought he and Abernathy and Julian Bond and Andrew Young, these are the stories that nobody tells you. That Miss Baker took great exception to those great men And because she felt at the heart of them that they were sexist patriarchs, and that until Black women stood up to them, then that movement would never continue. And she had a point, because a number of the Black women who limped, and Prathia Hall Wynn is the one who told me this, and Ruby Sales, many of them who limped out of the Black Power movement in the 60s, found their voice in the 70s with the women's movement, and they began to enter into various kinds of leadership. But the brothers did not give them a voice. And they found their voice when they entered into a women's consciousness movement of the 70s, and ultimately came into the ministry, as Prathia said, in the late 70s, et cetera, et cetera. So come celebrate with me that every day there's been something that has tried to kill me, and it has failed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weems. We're getting our faces off the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Reverend Yvette Blair, and then I'm going to leave you and my colleague, Dr. Lisa Weaver, is going to take over here.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Mitzi. It is an honor to be on this panel and to join with the other women here. I come to this responsibility of saying her name in an eco-womanist sense, of saying the names of the girls and women whose connection to the land is in our memory. We come to the land and we seek permission from the land to tell its stories, to reveal the pain and the shame and the hope and the healing. Land is where we came to ourselves. It's where our mothers and grandmothers told us to go out into the backyard and to collect yourself. Land is where we had our first food. It's where we had our mud pies, where we held the wet earth in our hands and we patted it and formed it and shaped it and looked at it and said, it is good. And we even tasted it to say that it is good. So when we think about land and we think about saying her name, we think about how that connection to land has connected all of us. And names like Sandra Bland, when she was little, she too probably played with mud pies. Little girls like Breonna Taylor, Rakia Boyd, they too played with mud pies, and now their voices are too soon part of the voices of the ancestors of the land. And so in that sense, as I think about my work of food apartheid and gentrification and displacement of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples, it really takes me to the text in Numbers 27, where we look at the 5 daughters of Zelophehad. So I think about Mala and Noah and Hagla and Milcah and Tirzah, how they came forward and at this tent of meetings, and they did it in this really powerful way of interrupting patriarchy and scaling the walls of oppressive systems and coming in this collective spirit of the African principle of Ubuntu, this collective sense of humanity of I am because we are. And it says that we insist. So when they came forward, not only was it a sense of resist and persist, but it was also this sense of we insist, because when they stepped forward, they were breaking tradition and seeking to subvert this systemic structure of patriarchy. I look at these women and I imagine them as African-American women who are somebodies, whose presence began to dismantle the good old boy system. And so they came in the full collective of the ancestors, not just their father who is named in the text, but of their mothers and their grandparents. And so I think their act of resistance embodies for us how their voices matter, and how that same approach today can help us to break the codes of institutional racism, because they came with the full understanding of the law and how to speak that language. I think it was Audre Lorde who said, we use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. So what these five sisters did was revolutionary. They were womanish, and it was also political, because their unapologetic move caused a statute and ordinance change in Israel, which basically was a change in the Torah. Because God is the one, when Moses went to God to say, these women have come forward, what should I do? And God sided with the women and said, yes, they have an entitlement to the inheritance of the land. And so I believe that in their proclamation of being very precise, of saying, give us a possession among our father's brothers, give us our father's inheritance, give us our land, it's that same kind of language that Black women, we have had to stand forth and assert our agency and say, give to us what rightfully belongs to us. We have always had to say, give me what's mine, right? And so they were speaking from this approach of eco-womanism in the sense of doing justice for the land. In other words, I believe that they were also unmuting the voice of the land. Melanie Harris talks about eco-memory in her work, this sense of our connected memory to land and to us. So I think as we look at this eco-womanist theological framework, we look through the lens and we have to ask ourselves, do we see the land as a subject with a voice, or do we see it as an object to be exploited? We might know that there has been considerable harm done in the hermeneutic of preaching about land from a sense of domination, which is this really egregious interpretation of the Genesis 1:27 text, where God says, have dominion over the land. That has been misinterpreted in this sense of dominating the land. And so in the way that Mala and Noah and Hagla and Milcah and Tisra showed up, asserting their agency and all of their womanist sass and disrupted the systemic structures of patriarchy, I think for us it's a modern day lesson of how their political and revolutionary acts of resistance is a protest. Dean Emily Towns calls it a protest against domination of land. So I think this protest, and so often how we find ourselves as Black women having to protest what it means to be evicted from the land. Anytime you have somebody who comes like a constable that comes and sets your things out on the yard, there's some trauma that happens when you are evicted from the land. There's displacement that happens. There's this dispossession that happens. And I'll even take it a step further and say that there's gentrification that happens. Because when you are seeking to remove us from the land, the Black women who have done the work, who have labored and toiled and tilled the land, and you're taking it away from us and taking us from the land and then putting up something else in its place, this sense of gentrification also causes trauma, and it's an abuse also to the land. Because when you separate land from the people who have tenderly tended to it, have stewarded it, and have cared for it, the land cries out. And I think when the earth quakes, it's crying out in pain at the injustices and the abuse against it and against the ancestors who tilled and toiled and took care of the land. It's a cry for ecological justice. And so I look at this text and I think about all the ways in which Black women have had to be daring and to step up. And we might say, how dare these five sisters step up to this assembly, step up to Moses and Eleazar the priest and to the whole assembly? Well, I say, how dare they not step up? How dare they not crush under their feet a system of abuse and the maniacal exploitation of African and Caribbean and Native American and Latinx and Hawaiian cultures and people, and there are earth-honoring practices of stewardship of God's land. Because we talk so much about ownership, but it's stewardship, because we are to steward what God has given us. And I think the other thing that we really see in here is this sense of this African cosmology that basically says that Black and brown and indigenous peoples honor the land and embrace the connections of the realms of spirit and nature and humanity. And it's this circular sense of interconnectedness that also resists these hierarchical structures and patriarchy. So I think also that Mother Earth is the sister whose voice that we can also unmute, and we can say her name along with that of Mala and Noah and Hagla and Milcah and Tisra, because these 5 sisters came speaking for the land as stewards and caretakers and caregivers. Bell Hooks talks about Black women and how we are wounded by forces of domination, and it wounds our hearts and our minds, our bodies and our spirits. And so I think as Black women, we understand the connection and relatability to land because of how our bodies were subjugated and exploited and dominated, just like the land has been. And so if that's true for us, it's also true for the land, because land is wounded. And in this eco-womanist approach, again, it's stewardship, not ownership. I think we can talk about the ways in which Black, brown, and indigenous peoples, how we see land in a sense of community and not in this white supremacist sense of capitalism. Unlike this colonization attitudes of conquering and commerce and exploitation, we look at land and we see land as building generational wealth through generational health. It's this collective sense of community that says we are one with the land, because land is where we come for healing. Land is where we get our medicines. It's not just where we get our food, but it's where we come for our healing. And so lastly, in this sense of my work of indigenous peoples, Black and brown people, then I also think of women like Dolores Clara Fernandez Huerta, who's a labor leader and civil rights activist whose work centers Mexican farmers and land and the hazards and the injustices that brown people faced in unsafe spaces on the land. I also think about our Hawaiian ancestors and Queen, I might say this wrong, Lulia Kalani, because there was a time in Hawaii's history in 1887 when her brother was king and white businessmen came in and forced him to sign a constitution that weakened the power of the Hawaiian monarch and removed the rights of Native Americans to vote unless they were landowners. So there's always been this sense of land as commerce when it comes to this racist, white supremacist sense. But for the queen, when she was dethroned, she traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. in the spirit of these 5 sisters, and she petitioned President Cleveland to reinstate her, even though he did not, or he agreed to do it, but Congress overturned it. But still, there's this sense of what it means when we step forward, and oftentimes there are opposing forces that try to push us back and that try to tell us that we're not granted the access to something that is rightfully ours. And so that 1.75 million acres of land that was stolen from the Hawaiian people that then became a part of the United States, I believe that that land was left exposed and it was left traumatized because the very people who cared for the land were separated from it. So as I close, I think about naming our ancestors. I think about my own great-great-great-great-grandmother, Mariah Blair, who had a homestead farm in Corsicana, Texas. And She's listed in the 1880 census as head of household. That in itself is liberation and freedom, because I think that language dismantles patriarchy. I think about her mother, Matilda Berry, who came with her. They came all the way from Arkansas during a time when, of course, we were still considered property. I think about Susan Hill on my maternal side, who purchased 52 acres of land in East Texas. I think about Estella Neal and how that leads to the Fannie Lou Hamers of our generations. And so as we name these names and we say the names of the Black women and the Black girls, understanding that there is memory and that there is memory associated also with the land.
Pastor Yvette Blair, thank you so much. We appreciate your contribution as well as all of the other women on the panel. It is our time to turn to Dr. Shively Smith.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, let me share my thanks to Dr. Mitzi Smith and to all my colleagues, my Womanist colleagues on the call for this important dialogue around reading and preaching scripture for freedom with attention to the hashtag Say Her Name campaign. In 2016, specifically in November, which is both my birthday month and the time of Advent, I always like to tell my daughters, we're starting all over again in the Christian calendar. I really began to pay attention to the hashtag Say Her Name campaign for a variety of reasons. One was and is that I was a mother of daughters. I have daughters. And I was noticing the disparity between the media coverage and public outrage of Black male deaths and violence as they were being broadcast more and more and captured more and more on video at the hands of police, and then how that is being covered or not when it comes to my Black sisters. And it was beginning to scare me. I have two chocolate girls who have spirit, who have creativity, who have tenacity, deep wells of love, kindness, tenderness, hope, and yes, womanish as all get out. And I began to wonder, would anyone care about the injustice if something happened to my daughters? I started paying attention to Say Her Name campaign because I realized apparently I was not and am not the only one with this concern, and that I am surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, of mothers, of aunties, of sisters, of friends, of neighbors who have experienced the very same fear. They too were asking the question, would anyone care? Does anyone care if something happens to our girls, to our daughters? This evening, as one raised in Louisville, Kentucky, the Say Her Name campaign is all the more important for me because Breonna Taylor's death placed the campaign on my doorstep in a very real way. How do we talk or situate the Say Her Name campaign in relationship to the work Black women do as interpreters of not just the Bible, the Jewish scriptures, the Christian Testament, but sacred text, and as proclaimers of freedom, liberation, and hope? How does sitting at that intersection make a demand on us to do more and to be more present? As a mother of daughters, as a daughter, as a niece, as a biblical scholar, as a writer, as a teacher, as a preacher, as one who started preaching at 16 years old when it was unpopular to be preaching, and as one now who's situated in the AME church, what does it mean to be situated, to be coming at the task of interpreting, of proclaiming, of writing, when you have the Say Her Name campaign and your daughters, our girls, on our minds? In 2016, I was asking these questions, as I said, and I responded in an article for Sojourners and Odyssey Network in a piece under racial justice, under the racial justice section titled, "This Advent, Listen to Those Who Quote Unquote Say Her Name." In preparation for this, I started trying to figure out new words to write, and I found myself going back to that article because that was sort of my coming out, that I was over pretending like that the bodies and the experiences of Black females and Black girls are second to the brothers. I love the brothers. I've got brothers and friends and fathers and uncles and husbands sitting back there and all of that. But you can't talk about them and ignore us. And you certainly, as the mother hen in me would say, you certainly can't talk about them and ignore my daughters, my baby girls. And so I want to read a piece of this from you. Now, it's a much longer piece, but this really does capture how I enter this conversation and how I have continued and I'm continuing to enter and engage this conversation at the intersection of mom, at the intersection of biblical scholar, at the intersection of preacher, at the intersection of a Black woman. So please hear these words. The impact of the Say Her Name movement cannot be overstated. It gives voice to Black women's experiences of profiling and policing, setting the names and stories of women like Sandra Bland, Megan Hockaday, alongside the names and stories of Black men like Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, and now I would say George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. The Say Her Name movement is a resource that makes the public aware of the trauma and loss of life experienced by Black females in civilized society who often go unnoticed in the media barrage of reports about police brutality of Black males or crime incidents from historically Black and or low-income neighborhoods. With its growing presence across social media and its knowledgeable activists like Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, the hashtag Say Her Name campaign is reminiscent for me of John the Baptist's voice in the wilderness in Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Matthew's story about John the Baptist's wilderness experience sits at the intersection between class, political power, cultural identities, social inequities, and religious belief and practice. Language and speech run like unifying threads throughout this passage. In the story about John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness, the most common verb is the Greek word for to speak or to say, lego. It appears 6 times in 12 verses. Although the Greek word for to say in Matthew chapter 3, verse 2 is not translated in some modern translations like the NRSV and the Common English Bible, the word is present in the Greek manuscripts and translated as saying in the NIV and New King James Version. It is as if Matthew wants us to sing over and over again the power of what it means to say something. The repeated occurrences of to say are only one indicator of the importance of radical transformative speech that challenges leaders to change in practice, not just in words. The story about the content of John the Baptist's message contains other indicators such as language about proclamation, the voice crying out, and verbal confessions. The story rings loudly as it follows retellings about Jesus' ancestry, birth, visitations and celebrations, fear and state-sponsored executions, and resettlement and return. The first voice readers hear after the stories of Jesus' beginning is John the Baptist's courageous singing or prophetic saying something. What makes John's speech so unforgettable and forceful? John's address and actions model something for modern Christian, and I would just say faithful readers of the text. The intersection between present and future is a tense and frustrating space to live in. Yet that space makes a demand on us for faithful moral identity that is not wedded to moral social action misses the good news vision. In Matthew, the politics and policies of God's kingdom has a particular focus. It is attentive to the life struggles, circumstances, and traumas of the poor in spirit, of the persecuted righteous, of those who with childlike innocence, of the sufferers of violence, of my baby girls. The Say Her Name campaign is a modern John the Baptist voice in our midst. It casts a vision that names real bodies and real lives and puts out a courageous and prophetic call to action, a call for us to change, a call for us to center the bodies and the experiences and the voices and the tenacity and the audacity and the womanishness of what makes us beautiful Black women changing the world. Such transformation involves more than mere calibrations in our personal attitudes and feelings. It is change that demands invisible bodies be made visible. It is a call to systemic institutional overhauls in which a society of neighbors hold accountable those neighbors who would target, harm, and exploit some among us. There's more. I was really in a space, and I'm still in that space, as you can see. I read this lengthy piece, and I'm ending here just to say that I think, for me, this is what it really means to be in dialogue with the biblical text, Say Her Name, and then also my locations and communities and commitments. What does it mean to come talking about I have to say something? Because it's not just them out there or someone on TV. It is, in fact, Claudia and Trinity, my two daughters, that remind me every day and every morning, every night, what it means to read the text and to name our experiences so that they can be protected, and so that my nieces can be protected, so that my sister friends can be protected, so that my clergy sisters can be protected, so that my academic friends can be protected, so that we are the center of the conversation and not just the second or the next one up, that we actually begin the conversation from that space. I'll leave it there.
Dr. Shively Smith, thank you so much for inviting us to that clarion call and linking that with the text. Amen. We are so grateful. And next and finally, our last panelist, Professor Yolanda Norton. We turn to her. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. So I want to begin by telling a series of stories, because as a biblical scholar, we live with stories. The first is one that many of us know well. It's the story of Sophia from The Color Purple. We all remember the moment where, when Sophia is out with her children, she encounters the mayor's wife. And when asked whether or not she would like to take the responsibility of cleaning up after the mayor's wife, the mayor, and their family, Sophia responds not just with a no, but with a hell no. That moment of agency, of emphasis, is one that we have to live with throughout the story as Sophia continues to bear the consequences of her willfulness. And I begin with that story because there was a moment in my educational journey. I have read The Color Purple multiple times. As a student, I assign it multiple times over as a professor. But there was a moment in my educational journey when in class we were reading The Color Purple. And we arrived at this moment in Sophia's life in the narrative. And in this class that was mostly made up of white students, but was centered on the Black female experience. The white students wanted to celebrate the willfulness of Sophia, and the Black female students in the class were uncomfortable. And we took pause, because as we named in that space, we knew and continue to know what it means, what it costs Black women in public spaces to assert our agency and live into our willful, audacious behavior. Ironically enough, in our protest of this moment, the white students in the class decided outside of class that they would gather in protest of the Black women's protest. And so they gathered with other Black people outside of the class to talk about what was problematic about the Black female response to a Black woman's story. And the reality of this moment was, when it came back to the class, when people were held accountable for this kind of outside action, the reality was we all had to reckon with the fact that while many people like a characterization of Black women's agency, most people despise its lived reality and its actualization in spaces. And so we see this, I know that for the women who are on this call with me, we see this play out time and time again. When we step into the pulpit, when we walk into the classroom, students and colleagues are interested in our presence in these spaces so that they can commodify it, so that they can put pictures on the website and live stream the moments where we speak our truths, because it makes them feel better about who they are. But when we speak our reality into these spaces in ways that make white folks and Black men uncomfortable, we know that there will be consequences. When we as Black women decide that we are not interested in our students or our colleagues nursing on our breasts, there are consequences to the way that we are named in these spaces. And I say these things because they remind me of the story of Sandra Bland. Sandra Bland, long before she ended up in that car in Texas, was an activist in the Black Lives Matter movement. We found out after her death, there were a series of her posts that were circulated on the internet, where Bland said things like, "In the news we've seen of late, you could stand there, you could surrender to the cops, and you will still be killed." Sandra Bland is an epitome of what Dr. Mitzi Smith calls womanist sass. And I take up that terminology within the context of someone who has been labeled by her womanist sass. So what Dr. Smith says about this concept of womanist sass is that womanists are argumentative and sassy, are labeled as argumentative and sassy by men and women alike, simply for persistently expressing a desire to know more than is good for Black women to know, for seeking clarification or refusing to be silenced or dismissed. And all of that is true. And I want to expand on that to say that when certain women, read Black women, decide not only to know more, but to use that knowledge to create spaces for ourselves in the world as we see fit, this too is seen as audacious and sassy. Society has little or no tolerance for Black women who decide to define ourselves for ourselves and who are unbothered by the labels and articulations that are placed on us as a result of the decisions that we make. I think about Amanda Seales, the comedian, among other Black women who have recently said, we take up the banner of being an angry Black woman because we are not angry for no reason. You should stop worrying about us being angry and worry more about what you have done to create that anger in us. So when we decide to define ourselves for ourselves, create labels and articulations for ourselves, what happens is that things that are deemed acceptable, entrepreneurial, innovative, actions that are labeled with ingenuity and lauded when carried out by white men and women, and sometimes even by Black men, are deemed unacceptable, defiant, evil, and salacious when they are attached to Black women's bodies. And I use all of that as a framework to think very briefly about the person of Jezebel in the biblical narrative. And I won't belabor this for too long, but I want us to think briefly about 3 moments in the life of this character we call Jezebel. Jezebel is introduced in the biblical narrative in 1 Kings chapter 16. We hear her talked about in the context of Ahab, who has been labeled an evil, sinful king. And so when he's talked about, starting in verse 29, it reads as such: in the 38th year of King Asa of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. Ahab, son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And here it is in verse 31. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, he took as his wife Jezebel, the daughter of King Akbaal of the Syrians, and went and served Baal and worshiped him. So from the beginning of Jezebel's introduction into the story, we are to understand her as the source of some deviance on Ahab's part. And so we, as subversive readers of the text, might want to ask the question, what does it mean for a woman who is labeled as an outsider from the beginning of her journey in the story to be made vulnerable? Because not only because she is a woman, right? So those of us who know anything about how women's identities are formed in the biblical world, or how our identities are formed today, we know that too often in a patriarchal society, your safety, your security is constructed based on your proximity to male figures. So Jezebel's identity is to be understood in proximity to her father and now to her husband. These two men that she has to rely on come with some degree of liability, because if she cannot prop them up, right? That's what Black women are asked to do on a consistent basis. If she cannot prop them up, she is made vulnerable in the society in which she lives. And it becomes important because not only is she a woman who needs a man to live in the society, but she's a foreign woman who has now been labeled as the potential factor for the deviance of a people. When in reality, those of us who are historians understand that she had very little power to move the society away from the prophets of Yahweh. And there is more potency, more power on the side of Israel in moving people towards their social religious orientation. So when we are reintroduced to Jezebel in 1 Kings 21, the story that we're most familiar with is her and Naboth's vineyard. Now, I don't want to authorize the killing of a particular group of people, but what I think we don't pay enough attention to when we read Jezebel in 1 Kings 21 is that her actions, her agency, this letter that she sends to authorize the procurement of Naboth's vineyard, all of this happens in response to the impotence and inability of her husband, King Ahab. If, whether or not we agree with his desire to have this land, if he as king had been authoritative enough to acquire the land on his own terms as the king, she would not have had to step in and take the action that she took to ensure procurement of the land. And so we begin to vilify her in the story because of what she does, because of what her husband is unable to do, right? He finds himself in a puddle of despair, acting out of his impotence. And so she has to step up and raise the bar. And so as the story continues, right, there are several moments where Jezebel is introduced as a figure. We replace Ahab with Jehoram, her son. And that narrative continues. And so I'm most concerned about this moment that happens in 2 Kings 9, because when we get to 2 Kings 9, we have a standoff between Jehu and Jezebel. And what we know as readers of the text is that Jezebel's son has been murdered by Jehu and his troops. And so what happens is we often read Jezebel's character as overly sexualized in this moment because of how she puts on her makeup and stands in the window. But what most biblical scholars, historian, and ancient Near Eastern scholars will tell you is while there is some precedence for her putting on that makeup as an act of over-sexualization, that most likely what she's doing when she puts on her makeup and stands in the window is a moment of defiance. That this is not sexual paint, it is war paint. That she is standing there demanding to be seen in a world that does not want to see her. And what happens is when she stands in the window and she demands to be seen on her own terms, that is when she dies. When Yehu takes action and she dies. And so I think we have to talk about the ways in which we want to celebrate Yehu. And we may need to name him in a contextual reading as a representation of what I would call white fragility, maybe more specifically white male fragility, that sees Black women taking agency and decides that the only response to our agency and our willfulness is to stand at the city gates and call for our death. And we have to remember that in the biblical world, the city gates were sites of commerce and government jurisprudence. And so the ways in which the law, these sites of systems and official action are used to celebrate white men as power brokers and how they call for the death of Black women. And so I say all of these things, not because I want to normalize, I don't want to necessarily normalize all of Jezebel's behavior, but what I do want to do is say that when Black women decide to use their audacity, their audaciousness, that we need to question the way in which we evaluate their characters. So that I ask, or maybe more accurately, I demand on behalf of myself, my colleagues, my sisters, on behalf of Black women, that you not only say the name of Black women, but when you say it, you don't misinterpret our actions to fit into the stereotypes that you have already deemed will drive our way in the world. But also when you say our names, put some respect on it, because we have done the work when men who look like us and who don't look like us, who share our skin tone and our cultural ancestry, when they have fallen by the wayside, when they've acted or failed to act, when Black women step up and do what we deem necessary to save ourselves and the people around us, that you would put some respect on our names and remember us with a broader and more robust legacy.
Professor Norton, thank you so much for that walk through the text and those connections. And I want to thank all of our panelists who are here today for superb and fine, generative, laser sharp, insightful question and deep thought-provoking and stirring presentations and information. It's been rich and generative and fruitful. Reverend Rebecca Christian is also co-moderating with me, and we have some questions in the Q&A. So if, Rebecca, you would like to come and moderate these questions for the time that remains. It is 5:37, so we have about 23 minutes for questions.
Hi, so Dr. Weaver, there's one question up right now. Can you see it?
I can.
It says, my question has to do with intersectionality.
Sure, and I can read that.
Okay.
To the panelists, John Inscore Essick writes, my question has to do with intersectionality, which I try to practice. I interact with ADOS friends and colleagues regularly. Any thoughts on how I can better understand the ADOS community's apparent habit of minimizing or dismissing intersectionality? And that question is not directed to anyone in particular. Someone in the chat is asking, what is ADOS? And that is a question I have as well. So John, are you with us? If you can unmute your mic if you'd like to speak. Is John here?
I'll unmute him. I see him in the room. I'm going to unmute him. John, I'm going to unmute you. Okay. John, would you speak too?
American descendants of slavery.
Okay.
Antonio Brown, and some others are associated with that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, John.
I'm not sure that's a question for what we're trying to do in this. I mean, I recognize the question, and I really want to thank John for raising the question, talking about how intersectionality, if I'm remembering the question, how it gets minimized in the larger ADOS kind of conversations. Is that right,
Yes.
Dr. Weaver?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I mean, I hope and I think that we have, in various ways on this panel, certainly have talked about it, have at least referenced, talked about intersectionality. I'm not sure the question is pertinent to our particular, or how it immediately relates to what we are trying to do. But I mean, that it takes work. I mean, but if I can kind of sort of try to find some parallels about how you bring about change in organizations, how do you press particular points with organizations. I do think that our work here today is an attempt on our part as women to say that the Black Lives Matter movement is larger than just being about, just Black men. Obviously, it includes women and girls as well. So there is intersectionality there. There are obviously others of us on the panel who have done, just some robust work in trying to show how even our work as Black women are related to larger global movements and struggles. Those are ongoing kinds of work. And you either have the kind of personality to persevere in those circles and to press those points, or you don't. You find allies, you find common areas of conversation. And these are kinds of things that you do over time. There's no magic bullet to how you make organizations understand. You make certain people begin to understand, and it begins with ongoing conversation. And that's what we're trying to do here. So I guess that would be my answer.
Thank you, Weaver. Thank you, Dr. Weems. Does anyone else want to respond as we move on? And John, thank you for your question. The next question that I see in the chat, it is anonymous, is Black women caring for children who have disabilities are silenced differently and similarly as they seek refuge as individuals and for their children. The question is, how can they find themselves in this movement as they are restricted and homebound?
Dr. Weaver, I'll respond to that one. I think to the anonymous attendee that you're asking, how do you assist in this movement if you're restricted and homebound? If that's the case, there's many ways digitally. Organizations are looking for people to help get information out via email blast, via podcasting, via YouTube, via Instagram and Facebook. That could be a way. It's also helping with mass mailings. And so if that's your question about how you can add voice to this, that's one way to do it. There are different mediums and different ways to use our voice. So I highly suggest podcasting, because as podcasting, you get to tell the story and highlight issues that typically mass media would overlook. So that would be my response as a podcaster.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Also, to the anonymous poster, there are Reverend Dr. LaTanya Penny is in North Carolina. I believe it's New Mount Zion Baptist Church. She is African-American woman with 2 children, who live with disabilities, and a lot of her work focuses around there. And so you can look her up on Facebook, or you can Google her, and she would be a good resource as a Black woman of color. As a Black woman and a woman who is a parent of children who live with disabilities. She's an excellent resource. So if you want to look her up and send her a message, I would recommend that. And she can network you to sources and resources as well. So I would strongly recommend that. So thank you for your question. Another question, this one is specifically to Dr. Weems. Dr. Weems spoke so eloquently regarding the sexism, i.e. anti-womanism we experience. Any suggestions to how and where we begin to address this issue within our denominations? I want to say, the question is directed to Dr. Weems specifically, but I think in the particularities of different denominations, I would invite other women to speak into the space as well.
Yeah. I do invite others. I think that we've all kind of touched on it in some ways. Let me touch on it in my own kind of way, and I absolutely hope my colleagues would join in. I am at the risk of, well, let me just say, I am not, there are no 3 steps to dismantling sexism. There's no 7 steps to any of these kinds of things. There are no steps to it. What we are doing right here is part of the work. What we are doing on this panel and what we are doing individually as women, and what many of the people who are right there in the chat room are doing, we are doing this kind of work. And this kind of work is done, I want to say, let me go back to the word of intersectionally it is done. It is done by those of us who are religious scholars. The success of any movement is that it is done interdisciplinarily, or if you will, or intersectionally, if you will, or globally, if you will. So those of us who are in religion, those of us who are in the law field, those in medicine, those in in the corporate world. So these are movements where there's pressure that's being brought to bear in various areas. And as we have said, because we are talking about systemic oppression, we're not just talking about women in the church are oppressed. And so therefore, if we get women in the church oppressed, unoppressed, then what? We are oppressed and invisible in the church because we are also oppressed and invisible in a large, many of our system, in our very culture. So I think that it is ongoing work. It is about reading. It's about participating and making yourself available to these kinds of panels. It is about building alliances with others who are doing the important kind of work. I'll stop right there because I know we only have a few minutes. I could go on and on, but I invite my other colleagues to say some things as well.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Weems.
Yeah, sure.
I'll say one of the things that I think that's really important in terms of this intersectional dismantling that Dr. Weems lifted up, and something that she already pointed to, but I always talk about is proximity. And so I think that there's a way in which that intersectional dismantling occurs by sort of, particularly if we're thinking about in church spaces, in religious spaces, some of these social spaces, by us opting to be in proximity to each other and to allow that proximity to do its good work. So we have all been shaped and formed in this society and by this history of patriarchy, this history of sexism, this history of racism, classism. And so there's no way around it. In some ways, we are all recovering people who are dealing with classism. You're recovering from that. You're recovering from racism, or you're recovering from sexism. Like, you never are not having to deal with the fact that we are shaped in an environment that has this. And so when I think about what it looks like in sort of religious locations, I think it's an opportunity for, I always like to say, some of my brothers who are like, as a person who doesn't have brothers, I have a lot of friend brothers now who are my brothers. I'm like, it's your responsibility to make sure that you have some sisters that are traveling around near you that can say, so that was the sexist thing that you did right there, right? Like, the most well-meaning, you can't help but slip. But you know, if you've got some truth-telling people right next to, they can say, so you know that you just totally dismissed all the Black women preachers that were sitting there. I mean, so I think that proximity requires a certain level of courage, a certain level of vulnerability and humility to say, so I need you to travel with me because I'm going to have slip-ups. And or how about this, blind spots? I just don't see it. I just don't know it. And those are opportunities for us to do this intersectional dismantling together in a real way. I'm going to leave it there to say I think proximity is powerful in this kind of work and necessary.
I agree with Dr. Weems and Dr. Smith. My training in social transformation with Vincent Harding also taught me that before society can be changed, individuals need to be changed. So I also want to speak to the need for us to stop apologizing for being Black women and work with our imposter syndromes and walk with, if we hear someone speaking disparagingly about Black women in our presence, not to joke around with it, but say something. And honor the women that are already have done the work, and be present with the women that have done the work, and not act like everything is fresh and new because we're using different technology. And so yes, alliances with all these other groups that have been talked about, but we need to do some individual work also. I really think we need to do some individual work. And then, as Dr. Harding taught me, then you become, you're in alliance with someone that's also done the individual work, and that's how things start changing. But until we do that, we're just gonna limp around and we'll circle right back around to feeling like we don't matter. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Weems, Dr. Shively, Dr. Fry-Brown. Another question in the chat reads as follows. Can anyone speak to the concept of religion being used as an opiate for slaves, particularly how Black women were used in this regard?
Okay. Sometimes this argument just grates on my nerves because someone evidently has never read history and doesn't know that Black people had feelings about faith before they even hit the boats. And so I just think it's very important that, to me, that becomes a null argument. That number one, they took opiate the people from Marx, which came a long time after enslavement period, chattel enslavement period. So they're pushing history together against itself. And so it also begins to say that Black women have no minds, and all you have to do is say Jesus, and they don't know how to think for themselves. And so it's an irritating argument. So let me just say that I don't agree with that statement at all, that I think that susceptibility to what goes on with religion has no gender attached to it. And if we studied the women that were prayer warriors, that were Zamani, the women that were the cultural center of faith during the times of enslavement and chattel slavery, I'm really not sure that was chattel, that was an opiate, because those are the people that were doing their own form of resistance while they were praying to whoever they named God, whether it was God in a rock or a tree, or some God that they heard somebody else talk about. So that's just my take on that. I think we kind of conflate too much stuff together because we don't open a book and open our mind and let somebody else tell us that Black women are always trying to tear down somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fry-Brown, for answering that. I'm going to move on to the next question, but it needed to be answered. A question reads from Lakendra Hardware. Can you speak to or share wisdom for the isolation aspect of carrying the work forward? How, oh, somebody just brought in another question. I am sorry, I lost it. Oh, how have or do you survive the work when you are alone, geographically or institutionally?
I think for most of us who are in the academy or in the churches or in churches, you come to a point of isolation. I remember being in my PhD program and having a professor say to me, "Oh, you have no idea how spoiled you are because you're looking around you at other Black scholars in formation. When you get to an institution, you will be the one. And if you are not the one, then you're lucky." I think the only way you survive this is to push past that, a bit of that mythology that you're the one who is by yourself, and to reach out to people who are also kind of spread out around the world trying to do this work. It can be intimidating to send that email, to find that connection, but I think for most of us who are doing the work, you'll find that we have a great compassion and a great heart for other Black women who are trying to create space for themselves in a world that really does not want to see us or create space for us.
I think this is a good question. I think also, you know, I don't want to play the old woman on the panel. You know, I don't want to play the sage, the one, you know, the rocking chair kind of. Y'all just don't know how good y'all got it. Because back in my day, I don't want to do that. I'm not doing that. I'm about to do that, but I don't want to do that. Okay, so let me just say that right now. I don't want to play that card, but I'm like, I mean, in the age of social media, there are just so many ways to have community. There's nothing like having somebody right there. There's no doubt about it. And for those of us who are academics, let me just say, it's an interesting thing. We are academics because in many ways we are introverts. We live in our head. We love living in our head. We love thinking. We don't really want to be around people, but we have to teach in order to make money. But we are basically introverts. We love scholarship. We don't love people. We love books. We love it. Okay. That's the truth of the matter in many ways. But then you discover that, but you are thrust into these institutions where you need people, you need allies, you need partners, you need to not be the only Black woman, the only one there in these institutions. But we find ourselves in those situations. One of the wonderful things about this, you know, those of you who are so much younger than I am, and those of you who are part of this digital world, is that it is virtual, but you have an opportunity to have community in a way that I didn't when I was starting off as a young scholar, or even as a young woman in ministry. I did not have this kind of community, the availability of this kind of rich community that you have. And so there is nothing like having someone there. I want to make sure that I say that. But at the same time, there are just so many ways to reach out and find people. And so when in my travels, I don't even know if we travel anymore. In COVID-19, let me just say, I'm so desperate to get on a plane and go somewhere. But that's a whole nother conversation. I was just telling my husband the other day, I said, you know, we have never lived in the same house with each other for 4 months this long. It's just crazy. I've been married to you 29 years. I'm always on a plane. Maybe we're not getting along because I don't know you. 4 months is too long to be with one person. Anyway, but as I'm really trying to say, what I'm really trying to say is that in my travels, and I meet Black women in institutions who are the director of the this and the director of the that. And I'm just amazed when they're the only ones and they don't know the rich array of Black women who are out here doing their work. And I'm like, baby, are you on Facebook? Are you on social media? There is no reason for you to be as lonely as I was and as isolated as I was in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. You can find community in a way that I could not. That was difficult for me. So I say, please, you know, avail yourself. And as Yolanda said, Dr. Norton, I get these names, these doctors and these reverend doctors, these whatever. Okay, yeah, you're right. You know, I know you as Yolanda. As she said, you can find this now. You have access, and there are people who will be willing to say yes. Oh, you are where? You in Nebraska? Girl, of course I'll let you call me. Yes, here is my cell number. I don't even let the person in Nashville talk to me, but you in Nebraska? Baby, here's my number. Yes, you need a girlfriend. So I think all of those things are very real for us. And I think we are a community. And if one woman says no, that doesn't mean that all women have said no. It just means that woman said no. She can't do it. She's at another place in her life. But that doesn't mean you have to sit around and say Black women are not, and Black women don't support. Just because 2 of us said no to you doesn't mean the whole community will say no.
Amen.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We have time for one more question. I'm trying to find a question that's not lengthy for the amount of time that we have. Charity Goodwin writes, can anyone say more about how we work on imposter syndrome?
Okay, so I'll take imposter syndrome. I think imposter syndrome, and this is Dr. Frye Brown actually already hit. I mean, I think you actually already said it. So I mean, on one level, there's a way in which what does it look like? So, in sort of womanist conversation, what does it look like to show up in a room and just have the audacity to say, "I belong in this room just like everybody else"? All right. So another place. Let me say it a different way. I love being a Black woman. I love being a Black woman. I tell my daughters this every day because I say, girl, you're a Black woman. Every time you show up in the room, you're more prepared than everybody else because your living has demanded it, right? My living has demanded it. My grandmama's living has demanded it. So you show up in a room instead of assuming that you're the imposter or even you're the only one. Why don't you show up in the room and assume that, you know what, my living and the living of my ancestors demanded that I'm more prepared than everybody else up in this room. Because we walk into the room and we recognize this. I would say Dr. Weems has said this, all of us have said that it's not just me being a Black, it's me being a woman, it's me being, I'm a first generation college student. So me being a first generation, I mean, all of these pieces are showing up in the room. And so instead of assuming that that makes me less prepared, what does that mean that that actually makes me more prepared? Because I actually know how to be versatile, or as I talk about in some of my work, I'm polylingual. I can have any number of different conversations, code switch my language, because my living has demanded it. So there's a way in which, for me, when we start talking about imposter syndrome or people are struggling with it, I say it first begins with embracing what it means, particularly if we're talking about Black women, women of color, what it means, what we have had to do and what our ancestors have had to do so that we could be in the room in the first place, and to see that as strength and as power. As I tell my 7-year-old Claudia, your superpower, you can call on that in a way that nobody else in the room can. So I'm gonna leave it there to say, I think we need to embrace the journeys that we are in and the many shoulders that we stand on, and see that as our strength.
Annie, I want to be mindful of our time. It is 6:01. This is scheduled to last until 6. I want to invite any of the panelists if they have any final words, thoughts, exhortations for our listeners and viewers.
I would probably just, and this sounds, well, it is what it is, but when I think in terms of doing the work, and there's still a lot of work to be done, even when we talk about the imposter syndrome, sometimes you really have to do the work to know what you've allowed to kind of get in your psyche. And so when you do walk into a room with all men or all male pastors, you really have to do the work, and you have to talk to yourself and eventually work on the other side of it. I'm not necessarily fully there as a Black woman pastor or preacher, but I will tell you this, that so much of who I am and so much of my thought process and my growth has come from reading. And when I was very, I'm a few months from being 60, but when I was younger, and I don't say this because she's on the line, she may have even heard this before, and most people know I'll quote the Bible, but I quote Renita Weems. And I think finding someone, as has been said, that have done the work, that can write about it, and that you can process it at home, drinking some tea, and get to and really get to do the work, and to hear someone that has experienced it help you through it. I mean, so much. The reason I've not lost my mind is because I read, one of the characters in one of her books that simply asks a question, well, what if I'm the one that I've been waiting for? And every time I begin to doubt myself, I hear that voice. And that's the story that Dr. Weems tells in one of her books. And so definitely do the work by reading and surrounding yourself with brilliant minds that have already, come through some of this.
I think the other thing I would say is just a reminder that your voice matters. So say something. In this sense of feeling like you are not a part of a community, maybe you are the person to create that community that you are looking for. And I say that in the sense of what we've already heard of just reaching out to other people. So whether you are in the academy or you are in the church, reach out to other people and begin to build that community that you are looking for. Learn how to network a little bit better. I think so often Black women, we do come into these spaces unapologetically bold, but we also come in maybe with a sense of apprehension a little times because we're not sure how we're going to be received. But come into those spaces and look for opportunities to be able to network. Check with some of the universities and see the different conferences and things that they have that are happening. Even now during this time of digital age, there are a lot of conferences that are taking place and they're posting that information out on social media. So look at that as an opportunity for connection and begin to build some relationships in that way. Because I think what you will find, just as I have, is there are other women just like you who are feeling like they are alone. They're just waiting for somebody to say it. And so you can be that person to say so.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on behalf of Reverend Dr. Mitzi Smith, want to thank all of the panelists who have been here and presented for their knowledge, their wisdom, and giving of their time and themselves. Want to thank all of you who are in attendance virtually, who are watching and listening. One of the things that we want to let you know, there were several requests for bibliographies. We are going to forward those requests to Dr. Smith and she will determine how those will be responded to, but we see all of your questions and we just want to thank you for your time here today and to please look out for Dr. Smith's next Zoom dialogue. So panelists, ladies, sisters, thank you so very much. Blessings to you all. Thank you for attending.
Thank you guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Rebecca, you're still here, yes?